framework.
Welcome to the Image Profile Report. I'm your host, Herb Glenn. When it comes to the dynamics of many of the things that go on in our community, it has to be an existence of interest involved with what are going to be the intellectual ways in which we can approach it in a manner that it would find the type of success that's important. And as we emulate these successes, how do we continue to find longevity? The person that's with me on this segment of our show is Mr. Dale Caldwell, who has basically come up with a strategy that can bring forth one of those obstacles that has been in our way, and that is the obstacle of being able to communicate with others in a positive way. Mr. Caldwell, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to be able to share with our viewers your wonderful talent.
Well, Herb, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
I think one of the most impressive things that I learned about you is that your dad was on the strategy team with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. How did you feel when you learned that?
Well, I have a picture in my office of my dad, Dr. King, and Ralph Abernathy at a press conference. They were actually organizing a protest to integrate the Boston public schools. And so Dr. King left BU just before my dad got there, and they got to know each other. And so it puts a heavy burden on me and others to really say we got to carry on the message. And the challenge is that urban communities are often worse off now than they were when my dad and Dr. King marched.
You know, and it's interesting that you would make that point, especially with the nuance we just heard about the opinion that has come down in relationship to the killing that happened in Staten Island. We heard and we saw the ridiculous situation that happened out in Missouri, I believe it is. One of the things that you can really attest to is the fact that we have to really find a better model. We can't recreate the old. Right. We have to come up with something new, and the strategies that you are introducing can bring us to that effective level. You are now working with a charter school environment. There's so much controversy over the charter school. Why are you attracted to it?
Well, and I'm unique in that I've been on the board of New Brunswick Public Schools since 1998. So I'm a big believer in traditional public schools, but I also believe that good charter schools are needed as well to try new things. So for the last year and a half, I've been the head of school at the Village Charter School in Trenton, 95% African American, kindergarten through 8th grade, 360 kids. And it's given me an incredible insight into the deep challenges in our community. Yet it's given me optimism and hope that with the right focus, we can really make a difference and stop the violence and change things in our community. But it's all built around this framework about influence that I've developed that has really changed my view of the world.
And when you talk about the thought of getting involved with a charter school because of the independence, but there are still some inequities. Now, I know my daughter, she's going to become a graduate of North Star. And North Star is a charter school that really emulated from New York, which gave them a better base to be able to create the structures for their success. But if it wasn't for the leadership in the school, it probably would not have been as successful. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because it's a charter that it's a better school or that it is the best school. Schools are really built off of the leadership of its foundation in terms of its administration. The thought of the influence model that you're talking about now, bringing you into the fold, was there a problem with the Village Charter School?
No, it's actually an interesting story that I've had a management consulting firm called Strategic Influence, which uses this influence framework. But I've been very active in education. I'm also president of the largest special needs school district, the Middlesex Regional Educational Services Commission, which serves 21 counties. And these are kids with emotional problems, autism, multiple disabilities, and we have an amazing superintendent there. So I've been involved in education as a volunteer. And a friend of mine said, well, you know, the rules have changed, so someone with significant leadership experience can run a troubled district. Dale, you should interview for the Trenton job. So I went through that process thinking, well, I'm not a certified educator, I'm not going to do well. But I actually was the leading candidate up until the very end when the union said, we don't want a business guy coming in to challenge us. Wow. So they pushed for the guy that's in there now. and he's worked very well with them, but there haven't been the changes that we need to really educate our kids. And so going through that process, I realized, it is about leadership, and it's about people who aren't traditional educators coming to these districts. And so I figured I wouldn't have a chance to do schools, and the Village Charter School called me, and their head of school was leaving. And this is a school that is on 10 acres, beautiful acres. It's African American kids. Too many of our schools that have turned around African American schools have not been turned around by African Americans. And so I felt this obligation because of my dad's experience to say, I've got to get out of the business and I got to give back. I got to make a difference. And so it's been an amazingly rewarding experience.
And seeing it in that context, that now you have this opportunity to do something trending that is a model that many people are not attracted to because they don't have any real control over it. There are some methods in which you are using that have really found some outcomes. Tell us exactly how this strategic influence idea came into existence.
Well, several years ago, I was going to write a book on leadership. And it's, there are a million books on leadership, but mine was going to be the best. And I looked up Webster's definition of leadership, command, and authority, and the word influence was there. And I started really thinking about influence, and the word influence is hidden in plain sight. That you'll watch the news and they'll say he's influential, she's influential, yet nobody really questions that. But then when you unpack it, you realize that everything we do, the way we think, the way we act, what we do is all built around influence. And that if you really understand that, you realize that you control your destiny. And that if you put the right influences in the right way, you can really make things happen. And so if you approach urban education that way and urban communities to realize that kids do what they do because of influence, then it gives you an insight into what you need to do and what kinds of influences you need to put in their lives to become successful. So one of the examples, and I was talking to teachers today, that teacher is often a bad name. Because what happens is a lot of teachers will teach. They'll have the curriculum. I taught the stuff. It was their job to learn. But instead, they're really influencers because the good teachers really try to influence the kids to want to learn, to get the students excited about what they do. So we're really using that model to say, you are an influence in urban education. Not every kid comes to class ready to learn or wanting to learn, but the good teachers will get them to learn. And that's changed everything.
Thinking about the idea and where it now has been put into a framework, that it provides a standard. When do you think you're going to be able to see those outcomes where it can say that this is true?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that's happening now, for those in the audience that may know, is we're entering this PARC, this new testing. They used to have NJASC, now it's the PARC testing, which is much more technical, and it's much more comprehensive. It's much harder, and a lot of folks don't want to do it. And there are a lot of negatives about it. But the good thing is that it's pulling people away from this 75% proficiency and really forcing us to focus on student growth. Whereas in the old model, which really hurt urban schools, a student would go from 170 to 190, 200 is passing, and the state wouldn't care. So because you're not proficient, it doesn't really matter. Well, now, since you're doing it on a case-by-case basis, a student going from 170 for 190 actually matters. Wow. And that really can make a difference. So folks really embrace that because they have no idea how schools, suburban or urban, are going to do on this PARC test. So if you really look at student growth, that's really where we should be to make sure every one of our students is doing better.
Now, the thought of saying in terms of the relationship of looking at what is going to be the improvement, the model itself is a pretty good standard to think about. The thought of where it's going to help change the problems that we're having with behavior in our schools, because it becomes the most pertinent issue when in most cases educators themselves get to the point where they feel that they spend more time disciplining the kid than educating the kid. Where do you think that medium is going to find its existence?
That's an excellent question, and one of the findings that I've really discovered in my school is that so many of our students are dealing with emotional challenges, and in fact they're really dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and a form of it. And for those that don't know, that's what many military people are coming back with. And so I was talking to the mayor of Newark a few weeks ago, and I was talking about post-traumatic stress disorder in kids in my school, and he said, Dale, it's really not post, it's current. And so I really have coined and just wrote an article about what I'm calling urban traumatic stress disorder, because many of these kids are experiencing gunshots, they're experiencing abuse, and it's continuous. It's not one time and they're away from it. And yet that impact, these are often very, very brilliant kids, but that impacts their ability to learn, that impacts their emotional, and what happens is there's a change in the brain. The amygdala and hippocampus of the brain are changed because of this trauma. Well, the good news is that social emotional programs, the programs often considered as being soft,
The amygdala
and the hippocampus are parts of the brain. The amygdala controls feeling, and so often we hear about kids.
and you're not an educator.
One thing I learned, I went to Princeton undergrad, and I learned you got to study and read, and so
Okay.
you learn. But the amygdala controls feelings, and
Okay.
so often you'll find kids will kill other people indiscriminately. And it's not because they were born bad seeds, it's because they were influenced negatively and their brain changed and they don't feel the other person. But there's hope, because the good news is that these social emotional programs, music programs, art programs, even sports programs, can really help these kids change the brain back to something where they can be integrated back into the classroom. The trouble is public policy doesn't recognize it. They have special ed for kids that are having trouble academically. They have regular ed. But they don't have anything to deal with these smart kids who have emotional challenges, and they're the ones disturbing the class often.
Right.
And they're preventing other kids from learning. And so this, I think, is one of the key ingredients in the academic achievement gap between urban and suburban students, is this emotional trauma. And one of the things that the Obama administration will be remembered for, and many people don't know this, is they have invested in studying the brain. You're hearing more about post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's actually they'll be remembered more for that, I think, than even the Obamacare. And so you're going to start hearing more, because we don't know much about the brain. And public policy has not taken that into account. And so in my charter school, because it's small and we can control it, we're really trying to do some things that you really couldn't do in a traditional school, to be the tail wagging the dog. And it's really, really exciting. And so the response to the article I wrote on this UTSD, urban traumatic stress disorder, has really been nothing short of remarkable, because everyone who works with our kids says, that's it. This is really what they're dealing with. And these are smart kids, but we need to help them so that they can get back and focus on education.
The dynamics of really looking at it in terms of finding a method of being able to transfer the energy from public safety to public health.
Exactly.
Is one of the areas that we really are going to have to put a lot of concentration in. The approach that you talk about in regard to the urban traumatic stress, and looking at it from a perspective that it has to deal with the influences of the home. How do we approach bringing it into a community environment? Because in most cases, for instance, I believe that it might have been something that the mayor of New York had found to be a promise, simply because of the $130 million that he's now putting into the prison system.
Right.
But it's dealing with public health opposed to public safety.
Exactly.
Will that be the area that we need to really focus on putting some influence behind?
Absolutely, because it's really all about influence. And if you look at a community, I mean, one of the reasons that the Harlem Children's Zone has been successful is because they've intensified positive influence around a targeted area. And so really what you're talking about is really the next phase of that, to really look at public health. One of the things that I talk to my teachers about is, we need to really differentiate between education issues and health issues. And there's a fine line in urban schools that kids are dealing with or acting up because of these emotional health issues, and yet public policy is trying to make these educators deal with health issues. And guess what? It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so dealing with the health issues in a neighborhood way that you're talking about is brilliant. And really reallocating the funds. I used to be Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs here in New Jersey, which oversaw all municipalities and housing. And one of the things that really distressed me is that the DCA, Department of Community Affairs, doesn't talk to Human Services, which doesn't talk to education. All of these, there's enough money out there. If it was targeted towards these kinds of health issues, there's enough money to really begin to turn around our communities. And then labor, because jobs are a piece of this. One of the challenges is that so many of my parents are loving parents, but they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they're trying to find a job, and they can't advocate for their child the way that suburban parents who have a job do. So that Department of Labor and Health and Human Services coming together around a community is really the way to transform it.
The ability for you to also identify the area of the arts and the improvement of a person's ability to be able to function in our community and in our lifestyles better. When you were head of Crossroads, did you see that the area of expertise in that particular area found the disciplines that were necessary to show where the improvement for the use of culture and using, music and entertainment as a method of approaching our youth in particular was going to be effective?
Herb, that's a great question. Absolutely, it was so obvious that one of the things about art, especially for urban kids, is that it allows kids to leave their environment without physically going. So you can see kids transform by thinking that they're in Africa or thinking that, and Ricardo Kahn, the founder, was just brilliant at really helping kids do that. That needs to be brought into the program. One of the things that distressed me the most is how little concern there was from the public sector about supporting the arts. Yet the arts are ways to transform communities. The arts are ways to make a difference. And here you have a theater. I happen to be on stage with Rick to accept the Tony Award, first black theater to win the best regional theater in the country Tony Award. And so here you have that, and it was just, we thought that that people would support us left and right, but it was just the opposite. There really wasn't the support for this brilliant local theater, a gem in the nation, to really start doing things in schools and really helping kids. But part of it is that when you start unpacking this idea of influence, is that we're built in America about this false idea that the self-made man, that people pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And when you start really unpacking and asking people, well, how did you become successful, Bill Gates? Well, there were all sorts of influences in his life that made him who he was. And yet public policy really looked at these kids and said, well, you need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and really deal with your own problems. And that's the mentality of public policy, yet that's a fallacy. No one has ever done it alone. And so when we break away from that, and one of the things too, that when I was at DCA, I was in an anti-poverty conference, and a lot of people were talking about the safety net, and I like to be a little controversial sometimes, and said, I don't believe in the safety net. I believe in the safety trampoline, because the safety net catches people and keeps them down. Yeah. So our public policy is to keep people from being homeless, and we think we're fine because they're going to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. The safety trampoline really takes kids and adults and bounces them back so that they're productive members of society. And that's a totally different mindset. And we're stuck in this first safety net mentality because it eases our conscience. Yet it doesn't improve society.
And looking at that whole reality in terms of many of the methods that have been really brought into existence by educators, by people who have been able to find funding to do these kinds of studies are the ones that have made us feel as that was the norm.
Right.
We're changing the norm.
Right, absolutely.
The norm needs to be changed.
Right.
But it is a logical norm that we're really bringing into existence. When you think about the logical norm, when you talk about influence, and when you look at it from that perspective, in most cases, we're not thinking of it as influence. We're thinking of it as favor. We're thinking of, well, these are the people that I know. I grew up with them. I went to school. I don't trust anybody. I felt that a lot of times.
Yep,
I felt that I could not get the kind of information or the kind of attention that I wanted towards an idea because I didn't go to the same school with the person that was in charge. With an idea of bringing about a knowledge of influence, how do you teach someone to use influence properly, or to even know how to effectively find influence?
Again, a great question. So one of the things in the 4-step process, the first is what we call influence awareness. And we begin by asking people, who are the influences in your life? And that really changes the game, because it really gets people to think about people they hadn't thought about for years, who their 7th grade math teacher that made them like math, their mom and their dad, and some negative influences as well. So when you do that, you start developing this idea of influence. It actually is really important. Then we do influence impact to really say, well, how are you currently are you influencing the way you want to? And if you're not, where are you weak? And then we have influence management, where we really help people identify and bring into their sphere of influence the kinds of influences they need. But really the most important piece is what we call influence maximization, and that every successful human interaction, doesn't matter if you're trying to sell, doesn't matter if it's your spouse, doesn't matter, has three elements, and one is credibility. The first is you got to be credible. I mean, if you're not credible, nobody's going to listen to you.
Right.
The second is creativity, and so you have to once they accept you as being credible, you have to come up with things in new and interesting ways. But that's not enough. The third and the hardest one is connection. Once you're credible, once you're creative, you have to connect with that person on an individual basis. And if you don't understand the influences in your life, the only way you're not going to be able to connect with other people, because the way to connect is through influences in their life. And so when you have that credibility, creativity, and connection, and I encourage you and the audience, try that out. If you're talking to your spouse and when you're shot down for something, you probably didn't have credibility. So every time it doesn't work, one of those things is missing. And when you start thinking about it, it really makes sense and allow you to really get influence in places you didn't have before.
With your process and your training, these are the steps that people are able to magnify so that they can, because these are some really logical techniques.
Absolutely.
I mean, you have to think the fact of credibility, creativity, and connection.
Exactly.
And knowing how to find what you're looking for. I think that's what we did today.
Yeah, exactly.
You
exactly.
know?
Absolutely.
But I never thought about it from that perspective. I just said, Dale, and I know Dale, I'm going to call it Dale, Dale come down. But now you have exposed a great deal of information that's really important to ideas that I've come through and have found pitfalls and barriers. But I can logically think through it simply because of using these specific techniques. The ability to be able to do that on a younger lifestyle with kids, what would be the grade level that you would think we should start this with?
Well, and it really starts as soon as kids are born, literally, because again, they may not speak, but there's a you're feeding me, so you have credibility. Moms, you're feeding me, so then you feed me. I kind of like that, so that's a little bit of the creativity, and then you connect. There's this loving bond, and it's just interesting. I talk to moms and dads. It's just amazing how when kids are born, father-daughter connection, mother-son connection. There's just something unique about that connection is there, and it's part of the human dynamic. One of the other things that before we finish that related to influence that I think is important to get out, especially in light of Ferguson and what was just happened in New York, is that so often, and my dad talks a lot about racism, and racism is a conscious thing. But there's the term that I'm phrasing and actually have influencism.com is influencism. That what happens is so many people, and I think that's part of the situation with police, and they're influenced to look at black people a certain way. They're not necessarily, it's not a conscious racism that I hate black people, but they're influenced to think that black people a certain way, and they shoot before thinking sometimes because of this influencism. And so I think, part of this conversation of racism and influencism is that we need to really kind of talk about both, because the influencism becomes a much more logical, easier conversation to say, how have I been influenced to view black people? And one of the ways to deal with this Ferguson issues is to really start to say, well, how have I been influenced to think of people? Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink. And in it, he talks about the instantaneous judgments that we have in a blink of an eye. And so going back to a child or something, there are instantaneous judgments that have been put into our mind. So sometimes people see a black person and they instantaneously think things that they don't even know they're thinking. And that's influencism. And so we need to really begin to unpack that. And I found when I opened this Pandora's box of this idea of influence, it really makes conversations a lot easier.
The idea of being able to come up with a concept to deal with how we can focus on conflicts in parenting and developing methods in which individuals can be able to communicate in a more progressive level opposed to the problems that we're having in our community is going to be a fascinating opportunity to create a study behind. I'm very proud and very happy that you're going to be a part of us really putting together this convention and looking towards a concept that's going to emulate something that we could probably take across the country.
Absolutely.
You are going to be the driving force behind it, Dale. I'm just really excited about knowing that I'll be working with you. And it's just going to be a dramatic change in terms of what we're looking to do in terms of what urban theory is going to be looked at in the future. It's so important that we let our viewers know that this idea of influence is something that we can be able to take and work into our daily lives, and we certainly are going to look for an opportunity to build a better association and bring Mr. Caldwell into the community so that everyone can be able to absorb this wonderful knowledge that he has. Dale, I thank you very much for being with us this evening. We're going to look forward to coming up with the plan and the focus on how we want to represent this wonderful idea that you have brought into existence. Strategic Influence is the name of his company. You said influence.com is the website?
IntelligentInfluence.com.
IntelligentInfluence.com is where you can certainly find more information, and we're going to be looking forward to working with you in the future.
I'm very excited, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in.